The gamble. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as 5 men sat in the private room of Manhattan's most exclusive gentlemen's club. Cigar smoke curled lazily toward the vaulted ceiling while chips worth more than most people's annual salaries changed hands with casual indifference. Damian Cross leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he studied his cards. At 32, he had built a tech empire that stretched across 3 continents, turning small communities into server farms and data centers with ruthless efficiency. Tonight, however, his focus wasn't on business. It was on the fascinating challenge his friends had just presented. "You're telling me," Damian said, tapping his cards against the table, "that I can't convince one small-town activist to see things my way?" His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem money couldn't solve. James Morrison, heir to a shipping fortune, chuckled as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "Not just any activist, Cross. This Nora Bennett woman has been making your life hell for 3 months. She's got half of Millbrook convinced you're the devil incarnate. The other half already knew it," added Thomas Whitmore, causing the group to erupt in laughter. Damian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Millbrook situation had indeed been more challenging than anticipated. The tiny New England town sat on prime real estate perfect for his newest data center, but the locals had proven surprisingly resistant to his acquisition offers. At the center of their resistance stood Nora Bennett, a woman he'd only seen in newspaper photos and security footage, but who had managed to organize the most effective opposition he'd faced in years. "She's different from your usual conquests," Morrison continued, dealing the next hand. "No interest in designer clothes or expensive restaurants. Word is she drives a 15-year-old Honda and lives in her deceased grandmother's cottage. Everyone has a price," Damian replied coolly. "Some people just haven't figured out what they're willing to sell yet." The comment drew knowing nods from around the table. These men had built their fortunes on the belief that everything and everyone could be bought, sold, or manipulated. It was a philosophy that had served them well in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. "Care to make it interesting?" Morrison's eyes gleamed with mischief. 10 million says you can't seduce her within 2 months. Not just sleep with her, make her genuinely fall for you. Hard enough that she'd call off this crusade of hers." The room fell silent except for the soft tick of an antique clock on the mantel. 10 million wasn't a significant sum to any of them, but the challenge represented something far more valuable: pride. Damian had built his reputation on an ability to get what he wanted, when he wanted it. The idea that some small-town idealist could resist him felt like a personal insult. "What exactly constitutes falling for me?" Damian asked, his tone suggesting he was already calculating strategies. "She has to publicly support your project," Morrison specified. "Stand up at one of those town meetings and tell everyone she's changed her mind about you and the data center. Has to be convincing, not just going through the motions. And if she discovers it's a bet, then you lose automatically. This has to be pure seduction, Cross. Charm, romance, whatever it takes to make her believe you're genuinely interested in her as a person." Damian considered this. He had studied Nora Bennett's background extensively as part of his acquisition strategy. 28 years old, master's degree in social work, had returned to Millbrook 3 years ago to care for her aging father after her mother's death. She worked part-time at the local library and spent her free time organizing community events and environmental initiatives. On paper, she seemed like every other small-town do-gooder he'd encountered, but there was something in those newspaper photos that intrigued him. Her eyes held a fierce intelligence and determination that reminded him of himself in his earlier days, before success had insulated him from genuine challenge. She wasn't just opposing his project, she was waging a sophisticated campaign that had actually forced him to reconsider his timeline. 2 months, he said finally, extending his hand toward Morrison. "But when I win, I want more than your money. I want all 5 of you to invest in the Millbrook expansion." "Full partnerships?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "That's a $50 million commitment. Then you'd better hope your assessment of Miss Bennett is accurate." They shook hands amid chuckles and congratulations, but Damian was already mentally shifting gears. This wasn't just about winning a bet anymore. It was about proving that his methods could overcome any obstacle, even one wrapped in small-town values and genuine conviction. As the evening wound down and the other men departed for their various entertainments, Damian remained at the table, staring out the window at the city lights below. Tomorrow he would travel to Millbrook and begin what he was certain would be the most interesting acquisition of his career. After all, he had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of charm, persistence, and strategic thinking. Nora Bennett would be no different. The Hunt, the sleek black Tesla, looked absurdly out of place parked outside Millbrook's only diner, drawing curious stares from locals who rarely saw vehicles worth more than their annual property taxes. Damien adjusted his tie, a perfectly calculated choice of understated luxury, and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk that hadn't been repaired since the 1980s. Marcus Webb, his assistant, climbed out of the passenger seat, tablet already in hand. At 26, Marcus had proven invaluable in orchestrating the kind of scenarios that required delicate timing and careful observation. He'd spent the past week in Millbrook, mapping Nora Bennett's routines with the precision of a military operation. "She'll be at the community center in 20 minutes, Marcus reported quietly. "Monthly planning meeting for the Harvest Festival. Ruby Martinez always brings coffee from her cafe, and Nora typically stays late to clean up." Damien nodded, studying the modest building across the street. The Millbrook Community Center had seen better days: peeling paint, a crooked sign, and windows that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. It was exactly the kind of place his data center would improve, bringing jobs and modernization to a town trapped in economic stagnation. "Remember," he told Marcus, "I'm here because I've had a change of heart. I want to understand the community's concerns before proceeding with any development." The story wasn't entirely fabricated. Damien had indeed decided to take a more personal approach to the Millbrook situation, though his motivations remained purely strategic. Sometimes the most efficient path forward required appearing to take a step back. Inside the community center, 24 residents sat in a circle of mismatched folding chairs, their voices carrying the comfortable familiarity of people who'd known each other for decades. Damien paused in the doorway, immediately identifying his target. Nora Bennett was smaller than he'd expected, barely reaching his shoulder even in her practical boots. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded denim jacket over a green sweater that had clearly been chosen for warmth rather than fashion. But when she looked up at his entrance, her brown eyes held the sharp intelligence he'd glimpsed in photographs, along with something else: immediate wariness. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, "I wasn't aware you'd accepted our invitation to tonight's meeting." "I hadn't received one," Damien replied smoothly, stepping forward with his most disarming smile. "But I realized I've been approaching this situation all wrong. I'd like to understand what Millbrook means to its residents before making any final decisions about the development." A murmur rippled through the group. Several faces showed cautious hope, while others remained skeptical. Nora's expression didn't shift from polite suspicion. "How convenient," said a woman from behind the coffee table. Ruby Martinez, according to Marcus's briefing. She was roughly Nora's age, with dark curls and the kind of expressive face that couldn't hide her thoughts. 3 months of legal threats, and now suddenly you want to chat?" "Ruby," Nora said quietly, though her eyes never left Damien's face. "Mr. Cross, you're welcome to observe tonight's meeting, but this is a closed community discussion." "Of course," Damien agreed, taking a seat in the back row. "I'm here to listen." For the next hour, he watched Nora orchestrate the meeting with impressive skill. She guided discussions about the upcoming Harvest Festival, mediated a minor dispute about parade route permissions, and somehow convinced 3 different committees to coordinate their conflicting schedules. She was patient with elderly Mrs. Patterson's repetitive concerns, encouraging to shy teenager Joel Martinez when he stammered through his first volunteer proposal, and diplomatically firm when the conversation threatened to derail into gossip. This wasn't the naive idealist Damien had expected. Nora Bennett was a natural leader who understood how to balance multiple competing interests while keeping everyone focused on common goals. Under different circumstances, he might have tried to recruit her. As the meeting concluded and residents began filtering out, Damien approached the front of the room where Nora was stacking chairs. "Impressive organization," he said, lifting 2 chairs onto the storage rack. "You've built something special here." "Don't," Nora said flatly. "Whatever this is, the surprise visit, the helpful comments, the sudden interest in our special community, I'm not buying it. Maybe I've realized there's more to consider than I initially thought." She turned to face him directly, her eyes searching his expression. "Mr. Cross, I've spent months researching your company's methods. You don't have changes of heart. You have strategies." From across the room, Ruby Martinez was watching their interaction with undisguised suspicion. Her arms crossed as she pretended to organize coffee supplies. Damien filed away her obvious protectiveness, another variable to manage. "Then give me a chance to prove you wrong," he said. "Have coffee with me tomorrow. One conversation." Nora studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "Good night, Mr. Cross." As she walked away, Damien found himself genuinely intrigued for the first time in years. This would be more challenging than anticipated, which only made winning more satisfying. Unexpected territory. 3 weeks into what Damien had privately termed Operation Millbrook, his carefully orchestrated plan began encountering unexpected complications. The most troubling was his growing reluctance to follow through with certain strategic moves that would have guaranteed success. It started small. During his second visit to Ruby's cafe, a calculated attempt to become a familiar presence in Nora's daily routine, he overheard Mrs. Patterson crying quietly in the corner booth. Her property taxes had increased again, and at 78, she was considering selling the house where she'd raised 4 children. The old Damien would have seen opportunity. Mrs. Patterson's property sat adjacent to his planned data center site, and her financial desperation could have provided leverage for a below-market acquisition. Instead, he found himself asking Marcus to research property tax relief programs and anonymously funding a legal aid consultation. "Sir," Marcus said carefully as they reviewed progress reports in Damien's temporary office at the Millbrook Inn, "your psychological profile suggested Miss Bennett responds to consistency and reliability. These charitable interventions might be counterproductive if she discovers them." Damien looked up from the report detailing Nora's latest community organizing efforts. She had somehow convinced 3 neighboring towns to join Millbrook's opposition coalition, turning his local problem into a regional headache. Yet instead of feeling frustrated, he found himself oddly impressed. "She's not going to discover them," he said, "and they serve our larger purpose of demonstrating community investment." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't entirely the truth either. The previous evening, he'd attended the town's weekly trivia night at Ruby's Cafe, ostensibly to continue building rapport, actually because Nora's delighted laughter when her team correctly answered a question about 1970s music had been the most genuine sound he'd heard in months. "Mr. Cross?" The soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Nora stood in his office doorway looking unusually hesitant. "Could I speak with you privately?" Marcus gathered his materials and left without being asked, closing the door behind him. Nora remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My father collapsed yesterday evening," she said without preamble. "He's stable now, but the hospital bills..." She took a breath. "I'm not asking for charity, but if you're genuinely interested in being part of this community, the medical center is struggling. Any support you could provide would help not just my family, but everyone." Damien studied her face, noting the exhaustion she was trying to hide and the way her jaw was set with determined pride. Frank Bennett had been a fixture at recent community events, a retired mechanic with twinkling eyes and endless stories about Millbrook's history. Damien had found himself genuinely enjoying the old man's company, which had been another unexpected complication. "What kind of support does the medical center need?" he asked. "Updated equipment, mostly. The cardiac monitoring system is from 1995, and Dr. Williams has been trying to get funding for a new ambulance for 3 years. Within his previous framework, this would have been perfect. Nora was vulnerable, asking for help, providing him with an ideal opportunity to demonstrate his value while placing her in his debt. But sitting across from her now, watching her struggle to maintain composure while her father fought for his health, Damien felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. "I'll have my foundation's medical grant division contact Dr. Williams directly," he said quietly. "Anonymous donation. The hospital won't know it came from me unless you choose to tell them." Nora's composure cracked slightly. "Why?" "Because your father is a good man who deserves quality care. Because this community has shown me hospitality even when opposing my business interests. Because..." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound calculated. "Because it's the right thing to do." For the first time since he'd arrived in Millbrook, Nora looked at him without suspicion. Instead, her eyes held something that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Genuine gratitude mixed with the beginning of trust. "Thank you," she whispered. As she left his office, Damien stared out the window at the town square, where children played around the fountain his company's development would eliminate. For the first time in his adult life, he questioned whether winning was worth the cost. The realization terrified him more than any business failure ever had. The reckoning, the manila envelope, arrived at Ruby's cafe on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who refused to say who had sent it. Ruby almost threw it away. Unmarked packages weren't uncommon in her line of work, but something about the expensive paper stock made her curious enough to open it. Inside were photographs. Damien and his friends at their exclusive club, shaking hands over poker chips. Below them, printed transcripts of recorded conversations, including one that made Ruby's blood run cold. 10 million says you can't seduce her within 2 months. Not just sleep with her, make her genuinely fall for you. Ruby sank into the chair behind her counter, her hands shaking as she read through the entire damning collection. Someone, likely one of Damien's so-called friends with a conscience or competitive grudge, had documented everything. The cruel wager, the strategic planning, even Marcus's surveillance reports on Nora's daily routines. For 6 weeks now, Ruby had watched her best friend slowly soften toward the man who had seemed determined to destroy their home. She'd witnessed Nora's surprise when Damien showed up to help repair storm damage at the community center. Her growing respect when he quietly funded Mrs. Patterson's property tax bill. Her cautious hope when he began attending town events without fanfare or cameras. Just yesterday, Nora had confessed that she was starting to see glimpses of genuine goodness in Damien Cross. The admission had been accompanied by a blush that Ruby hadn't seen since their college days. Now she understood why. It had all been performance, calculation, a game played by bored billionaires with other people's hearts as stakes. Ruby found Nora at the library, cataloging new donations in the quiet afternoon hours she'd always preferred for detailed work. The peaceful scene, autumn light streaming through tall windows, Nora humming softly as she worked, made what Ruby had to do even more heartbreaking. "We need to talk," Ruby said, closing the door behind her. Something in her voice made Nora look up immediately. "What's wrong?" Ruby placed the envelope on the desk between them. "Open it." The color drained from Nora's face as she read. Ruby watched her best friend's expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally devastating comprehension. When Nora reached the transcripts detailing exactly how Damien planned to seduce the stubborn activist, her hands began trembling. 6 weeks, Nora whispered. 6 weeks of lies. "Nora, he held my hand at the hospital when Dad had his second episode. He sat with me for 4 hours in that waiting room. I thought," she laughed bitterly, "I thought he was falling for me too." Ruby wanted to offer comfort, but what could she say? That Damien's recent actions seemed genuine? That his feelings might have evolved beyond the original bet? The evidence before them made such possibilities irrelevant. An hour later, Nora stood outside the Millbrook Inn, the envelope clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Damien answered his door, still dressed for the town council meeting they'd both attended. His tie loosened and sleeves rolled up in the casual elegance that had once seemed effortless. His smile faded the moment he saw her expression. "How much of it was real?" Nora asked, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Nora, I can explain." "How much?" she repeated, stepping into his room and closing the door. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a public scene. "The hospital visits? The storm cleanup? The quiet donations you thought I didn't know about?" Damien's face had gone very pale. "All of it. Everything since that first week, Nora, it's all been real." She threw the envelope at his chest, photographs scattering across the carpet. "A $10 million bet. Make the activist fall in love so you can get your building permits." "It started that way," he said desperately. "But it changed." "I changed. What I feel for you is built on lies." Nora's voice broke on the last word. "You studied my routines like I was a business acquisition. You calculated exactly how to manipulate me. Yes, at first. But Nora, please listen to me. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing how you care for people, how you fight for things that matter, it changed everything. I was going to tell you about the bet. I was going to end it. When? After you won your 10 million? After you convinced me to support your project at tomorrow's town meeting? Damien's silence was answer enough. I trusted you, Nora said quietly. For the first time in 3 years, I let someone past my defenses. I thought you were different. I thought you saw something in me worth. She stopped, shaking her head. I was just another business problem to solve. No, you were never, Mabron. She backed toward the door. Don't make this worse by pretending any of it meant something to you. As the door closed behind her, Damien sank to his knees among the scattered photographs, finally understanding what he had truly gambled away. Redemption's price. The Millbrook Town Meeting Hall buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in for what everyone expected would be the final confrontation with Damien Cross. Word had spread about Nora's dramatic exit from the inn 2 days prior, though no one knew the specific details. All they knew was that their strongest advocate had locked herself in her father's cottage and refused to see anyone except Ruby. Damien sat alone in the front row, ignoring the hostile stares and whispered conversations around him. He'd spent 48 hours in his hotel room, staring at those scattered photographs and confronting a truth that terrified him more than any business failure. He had become a man he no longer recognized or respected. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, his weathered face grave. Mr. Cross has requested time to address the community before we proceed with our formal response to his development proposal. Damien stood slowly, turning to face the people he'd spent 2 months manipulating and, unexpectedly, learning to genuinely care about. Mrs. Patterson sat in her usual spot, the woman whose property taxes he'd quietly paid. Joel Martinez was there with his parents, the shy teenager whose confidence he'd watched bloom during community meetings. Dr. Williams occupied the back corner, probably unaware that his new cardiac equipment had been funded by the man he clearly despised. I came to Millbrook with a plan, Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I intended to build a data center here regardless of your objections. I saw this community as an obstacle to overcome, not as people with legitimate concerns about your home. Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd, but he continued. I made a bet with friends that I could manipulate someone into supporting my project through charm and calculated kindness. That person was Nora Bennett, and I am deeply ashamed of what I attempted to do. The murmurs died into stunned silence. This wasn't the corporate doublespeak they'd expected. But something unexpected happened during my time here. You showed me what real community looks like. You taught me that some things can't and shouldn't be bought. You made me remember who I used to be before success made me cruel. He pulled a folded document from his jacket. Effective immediately, I'm withdrawing all development proposals for Millbrook and the surrounding area. Furthermore, I'm establishing a community preservation foundation with an initial endowment of $800 million, my entire liquid assets. The foundation will be managed by a board of local residents and will focus on protecting small communities from exactly the kind of predatory development I've specialized in. The silence stretched so long that Damien wondered if anyone had heard him. Then Mrs. Patterson started crying. Not the quiet tears he'd witnessed at Ruby's cafe, but deep, relieved sobs that seemed to unlock something in the rest of the room. Why? The question came from the back. Dr. Williams had stood, his skepticism evident. What's the catch? There isn't one, Damien said simply. I've spent 15 years building wealth by destroying communities like yours. I can't undo that damage, but I can try to prevent future harm. And Miss Bennett? Ruby's voice carried a protectiveness that made several residents nod approvingly. She deserves better than anything I can offer, Damien admitted. But she also deserves to know that her influence on me was real, even if my original intentions weren't. Over the following months, Damien quietly dismantled his development empire, facing lawsuits and financial ruin with a calm that surprised his former associates. He moved to a modest apartment 3 towns over and took a job teaching business ethics at the local community college, a position that initially paid him less per year than he'd once spent on a single dinner. He didn't attempt to contact Nora, but he heard updates through the community network that had embraced him cautiously, but genuinely. She was thriving as director of the new Preservation Foundation, traveling to help other communities facing similar threats. Her father had made a full recovery. She seemed happy. The knock on his apartment door came on a snowy January evening, 8 months after the town meeting. Nora stood in his hallway, looking nervous but determined. "I've been watching," she said without preamble. "The foundation work, your teaching, the fact that you've given away everything. Ruby says I'm an idiot for staying angry at a man who's genuinely changed. You had every right to be angry. You still do. Maybe. But I've also had time to think about those last few weeks before I learned about the bet. The way you looked at me, the things you said when no one else was around, that wasn't manipulation. That was you falling in love despite yourself." Damien's throat tightened. "It doesn't excuse how it started." "No, it doesn't, but it matters that it changed. That you changed." She stepped closer. "I think I'd like to try falling in love with the real you. If you're interested in earning it honestly this time." For the first time in his adult life, Damien Cross had found something more valuable than winning. The chance to deserve the love he'd nearly destroyed. "I'm very interested," he said softly, and meant it completely.